Okay, so this is the fourth of 4 videos looking at the UNDP facility. We hope you find it useful. We'll try and keep it to under 15 minutes. Not sure if we will this time. There's a lot of content. We're going to be focusing on the how, not the what, specifically exploring the narrative framing and communications. And we think this is critical to explore in terms of establishing the culture and modus operandi of the facility going forward. We're going to be looking at how to enable trust, and we think that that's through creating a truly co-created functionality where there's no prescription on the what. We think that it is about enshrining rebirth as the central narrative and using this as a mechanism to move from a better world, which everybody is aspiring to, returning to business as usual, to a better world where we're building better together. And we are thinking that we need to look at volume and diversity of stories, using every geographic and cultural story to establish a new common narrative, and essentially enabling the army of storytellers that we're going to need to change the overarching narrative, stimulus narrative. That's a bit of a mouthful. Guy, over to you. I'll interject as we go.
Thanks, Ben. I think probably over the last 3 videos that we've done, it's probably felt we've looked for a lot of insights in stuff that's happened in the past. I like this quote from David Attenborough, just for summing up the situation that we're in, where we've got a completely blank sheet of paper. And as a sort of storyteller and somebody who's interested in kind of narratives, it really feels that way, that things have shifted profoundly, and the things that have worked before are not going to work for us in story terms moving forward. But that's where we left you, sort of saying, right, what are your building blocks? And that's what we'll look to do in this video. And we're going to do it through sort of 3 stages. The first is around story as strategy. And I just want to make the point that when we're talking about story, we're not just thinking about key messages that might be part of communications to drive awareness for the facility. We're actually talking about how story can help shape the strategy of the facility, and in doing so, help make change happen. We're going to look at those building blocks, and that's then thinking about how does story work for change, and then looking at how you drag that into the facility deck. As a quick reminder, we know from the first series of videos that what we're trying to do is tell a better story, and that we need many more people to be telling that story. We also, just in summary, flag some things that we know we need to avoid talking about, such as the biggest threat to humanity or civil disobedience, that we need to be aware of as the story and time progresses, exhausted communities, the desire to get back to normal, but also making sure that the environment movement is very visible in playing its part throughout this period. But there's also a huge amount of positives to kind of focus on, particularly the elevation of science and expertise, and actually how we can bring in key workers and innovators into the environment story. This is just the one place where I'm going to go back to where we were, I guess, in video 1, and drawing on the sort of Hollywood references, but to make the very sort of serious and important point that you are not the hero of the facility story. The UNDP is not the hero. The UNDP is the mentor. And what we wish to do is make governments, business, and NGOs the heroes. And we want to be celebrating their partnerships, their innovations for good, and we want to be giving them a chance for redemption. And as a mentor, it's how you use your economic stimulus for change that is your gift to help the hero on his journey. So that's about recovery, renewal, it's about systems correction, and ultimately it's about redefinition of healthy relationships with economies and the planet. So in terms of our storyboard, they're the heroes, is the mentor. Let the story and the journey unfold. what we're going to do is we're just going to tackle these two things. So we're going to be filling in the building blocks as we talk about rebirth and trust as a strategy. So our recommendation is that the facility should offer a redemption and transformation story that allows governments and businesses to rebuild trust. The way that I want to talk or demonstrate what I mean by redemption and transformation in terms of story is by grounding it in 7 basic story types. So again, this is about a century-old academic rigor and endeavor to identify patterns that we're hardwired for, that more recently both Harvard and Stanford have sort of applied AI to look at hundreds of thousands of the most popular stories, and again sort of proving they kind of tend to be categorized in one of these 7 types. As we could see, capitalism has a relationship with the rags to riches story type, and I won't explain that any further, but to say that as climate breakdown has become established as a mainstream narrative, it's now, whether that's being enshrined in law, whether it's declarations of climate emergencies, whether it's sort of social consciousness, is fully established, which means capitalism is a sort of stagnant to kind of declining narrative, which has become, in story terms, a tragedy. And the thing about tragedy is that people avoid them. We all know how they end. We don't want to be around there when it does. However, we've also got new ideas, new narratives that are accelerating and growing. And these offer a different type of story. They offer rebirth. And actually, when you sort of combine them with, in economic terms, governments and private sector, they offer quests, they offer chances, again, to go from rags to riches. So a powerful set of story types that we're allowed to play with and should be playing into. When we look at this diagram, it's just to highlight that the green line is where we see rebirth and the red line is the tragedy story type. And actually, where we're headed without doing anything differently is towards tragedy, and that's where the kind of story's set at the moment. So I just want to explore that a little, because ironically, it is the better world of that story which is driving the tragic narrative. And that's because the better world can be summed up as the desire to get life back to normal as quickly as possible. But we've already,
as you pointed out in video 3, Guy, there are thousands of these getting back to normal as quickly as possible stories which are coming out and reinforcing in the opposite direction to where the environmental stories and narrative wants to go, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's going to be a huge challenge. One of the challenges, particularly for the governments, business and NGOs that we wish to have as the hero, is that actually if we get back to normal, by the time we get through to kind of post-surge, they're going to start to be identified as the villain in a lot of other people's stories. And that's because they would have missed the opportunity to do the right thing. That's how they'll be judged at that point in time. And this is key, because what we want to do is make sure that that story trajectory that we're on at the moment, which is towards getting life back to normal as quickly as possible and has governments, business and NGOs as the villain, we want to move away from that. And we want to make sure that in the post-surge scenario, they're actually the hero. And they're the heroes because they've protected and improved lives. And the better world is not back to normal, but that's actually better than before, because we have healthier values, we have healthier systems, we have healthier relationships. The key thing for doing this, from sort of moving from villain to hero in that post-surge, is really around how they act. So if they act with integrity, if they act with ethics, if they act with competence, then we're going to be able to deliver them as heroes in the story. And as the mentor, it's the support we can give them, helping them to allow with integrity and competence that's key.
I'm just going to give you a time check, so we're running a little over, just FYI.
Thank you. Sorry.
That's all right.
Complicated stuff, and I want to really just make sure that I'm bringing people with me through the kind of thought process here. Obviously, it would have been a lot easier in person, and with kind of Q&A. What I do want to kind of say is that what's starting to emerge with this kind of journey of change, that the how is much more important than why we're changing or kind of what we're changing to. And this is true, I think, not just of your story, but also of the actions of the facility. We'll come on to explain why.
I'm going to just slow you down there again, I'm afraid. So the facility deck talks about co-creation, and then it's very specific. So it's talking about the how and the what, and it's worth unpacking and exploring whether they're overly conflated. So could you peel back and look at the how to create a more enabling environment to rebuild trust?
And how we do the how is exactly what we're going to look into with this idea about rebuilding trust. Why do we need to rebuild trust? Well, a good way to look at this through stories is to realize and reflect on the fact that the stories we tell ourselves are based less on what we know and more on what we feel. And to describe what I mean by that, have a look at this quote from Hans Rosling, who basically, in identifying that over the past 20 years, the proportion of the global living in extreme poverty is halved, an absolutely revolutionary and important change in his lifetime, and a very basic fact to be known about life on Earth, is actually something that is not known by people. Only 7% when they're asked in a multiple choice of 3 questions get it right. So I think that probably makes them less than random. And the reason is if we think about capitalism known, if we sort of describe it that way, is that the stories are all sort of data driven. So it's all numbers about per capita income, mortality rates, availability of goods and services. And that tells us, the numbers tells us that life is getting better for all. But that's not what it feels like. So it feels like it doesn't work. And that's not just because of climate breakdown and biodiversity collapse. It's because of all the other things that we read about: billionaire bailouts. It's about fake news and privacy issues. It's about emission scandals and many, many, many more things. And actually, that narrative is then changing. And it's changing to, we can't trust institutions to do the right thing. Now, I'm not just sort of guessing at this. There's lots and lots of studies to kind of show that this is happening and this is true. The one that I'm using to highlight is the Edelman Trust Barometer, because they've been studying trust over the last 20 years and do it in a sophisticated way to get like a real sort of global insight. People today grant their trust based on 2 attributes: competence and ethical behavior, which really means doing the right thing and working to improve society. And even though we've got a strong global economy, or we had, and almost kind of like full employment, the fullest it's kind of been, actually the 4 societal institutions, government, media, business, and NGOs, have very, very, very little trust. The reason why this is because there's a paradox at the heart of it. So although we're sort of living better and have much more of kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs kind of met, actually, when we think about our future, we find ourselves being very fearful because we think that capitalism as it exists today is doing more harm than good in the world. So this is why we want to help governments and business rebuild trust by doing the right thing to secure the future. So as a mentor, you're not just providing stimulus, but actually you're providing the ability for governments and businesses and NGOs to rebuild trust. And so therefore it's how you provide the stimulus, which is the trigger for that. The ordinary world we know has got broken systems. That's the frustration. They need fixing. The villain is the lack of trust in institutions to do the right thing. That needs defeating in story terms. And so our call to adventure is not about bouncing back to the normal world, but actually it's about building better. And our crossing the threshold is getting people to sign up to that. So this is not going to be an easy job. Could be described as not being off to a good start from a low base. But what we have identified in the earlier videos is there's actually new allies emerging with gifts that are really important. So very quickly, although this is a snapshot from America, if you look down the most and least trusted professions to the bottom, you see politicians and business execs, very low trust. But actually right at the top, nurses, medical doctors, pharmacists, teachers, police officers, the people on the front line at the moment have huge trust in terms of honesty and ethical standards with regarded by the general population. Equally, we're starting to see the private sector, areas of the private sector stepping up and making a difference, and that being extremely well received by the general public. So, as well as the scientists and experts that are guiding us through the coronavirus, it's the key workers and also the innovators that are bringing to life alternatives right now that are healthier for the planet and healthier for our lives. We also identified in the last video certain aspects of the environment story that are working and that we can use. And so it's about bringing these into our story too. So first and foremost, in terms of challenges, it's definitely about saving lives and protecting the vulnerable. Second challenge, which gets a little bit harder, is actually about inspiring new thinking and making new connections. And that's just not intellectual connections, but physical collaborative connections too. It's about white space innovation. And then the third challenge is about mobilizing new action. And the real key here is demonstrating. You've got to show the real alternatives that are being deployed. So when we now sort of think about how we apply that to the facility deck, we've got our building blocks. And actually I could see I've left flatten the curve as kind of highlighted there, but that's just to make an important point actually, that however we use these building blocks, we're not going to be translating this language directly. We need to use the language and the framing that works. And there's probably a lot of testing that's required to do that. But one of the interesting things about the press releases and the news coverage that's been given to the private sector who is innovating is that actually they don't, you know, the language they use is about flattening the curve. So if that's the language they use, that's the language you should use too.
Well, and similarly in the previous slide, if you go back to just briefly, sorry, 3 there, that's the language and environment movement being brought into the facility story. So the language that the environment movement's using is mirrored, and therefore we're echoing elements of what the environment movement's trying to push forward. Back to you.
Thanks, Ben. So we said the how is really important, and we've said, we've kind of shown why it gives you a completely different story. And we wouldn't be talking about this type of story before the coronavirus for getting movement to kind of shift on doing things that are going to be better for the environment. But it's also true for the facility. So we want the facility to focus on the how, not the what. And there's 3 key areas, and I think Ben highlighted these right at the very beginning. So the first is about enabling trust. So this is truly co-created functionality. And by that, we mean not having prescription on what the what is. The second is about enshrining rebirth. So this is a story type which is really, really going to work, and we need to drive this narrative, use it as a mechanism to help move the better world from the business as usual to actually the one that improves lives, the one that delivers healthier values, healthier systems, healthier relationships with people and the planet. And the third is about volume and diversity. So clearly every geographic region, every culture is going to have a different tribal narrative, a different interpretation. It's not just about language, it's also about frames, it's about symbols, it's about rituals. What we need to be able to do is cascade this kind of like core story through so that it can be picked up and used, but also learn from the stories that are working that other people are generating, and make sure those are elevated and celebrated and shared amongst others. That is the only way that we go from not just creating a better story, but actually having thousands of better stories that are going to change and establish a new narrative. So the key next steps for a stronger story. So as mentioned, it is these steps of looking at the degrees of story and how they're bound to different cultures, different times, and different places. And this is because story, like strategy, is a living, messing thing. It is one of the reasons why we devised the kind of framework in the way that we did, because it isn't just about making a good diagnosis and analysis of stories and strengthening them, but it also allows us to test them. So we can sort of categorize and pick up on other stories by each of the individual building blocks. It then allows us to refine them and cascade them as well out to other organizations. So that's the end of this video. I'm sorry it was a little bit longer than we intended. I hope you found it useful stimulus to your thinking as you sort of design the facility, and we're really looking forward to talking about this in further depth with you on the call tomorrow.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, you know, because story like strategy and these videos is a really living, messy thing, I hope you'll excuse the glitches as we've gone forward. Again, to recap, we've looked at the how, not the what. We haven't gone granular into your deck. We think looking at the narrative framing and defining the how actually aids the creation of the facility from our point of view and what we can offer, more than diving into the detail. It defines the how, it defines the culture, it defines the modus operandi, and our hope is, as words that Guy used earlier, that in doing this and focusing on that how, we can create a mechanism or mechanisms that elevate and celebrate the thousands of stories from the private sector that can contribute to a narrative which shifts profoundly and fundamentally from the current crisis to address the twin environmental crises. Very much looking forward to the conversation tomorrow. Good night from us and good afternoon to you.